Good morning, everyone. Thank you for participating in this NYSAC webinar to provide counties with information and an update on election reforms. NTF Data Services, LLC is sponsoring today's webinar. A New York State-based company, NTF Data Services, LLC provides county boards of elections with election software and services specifically built around New York State election law requirements. NTF serves 50 counties across the Empire State with the tools and design architecture necessary to meet the changing election requirements of today as well as tomorrow. This includes the development of the most data-secure electronic poll books for use by New York State County Boards of Elections for early voting and election day requirements. Before we begin today's webinar, I would like to recognize Mark Levine, the NYSAC Deputy Executive Director, for a brief introduction. Mark?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this NYSAC webinar to provide counties with information and an update on election reforms enacted so far during this 2019 legislative session. I am, on behalf of Stephen Aquario, who's the Executive Director of the New York State Association of Counties, who was called away for a medical appointment for his mother this morning, and he wanted me to step in and welcome you. This year, the state legislature has made significant election law reforms. In a moment, you will hear about some of those reforms, early voting legislation, and consolidating the primary elections to the fourth Tuesday in June, pre-registration of minors, voter registration transfers, LLC loophole reform, upstate primary voting hours, paid time off for voting, electronic poll book authorization. All of these items have been adopted by the state legislature and signed into law by the governor. So we are here this morning to discuss these reforms and others that might be on the horizon, and we appreciate our expert presenters joining us for this discussion. Again, thank you for being with us today. We hope you find this presentation helpful and educational.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for that introduction. We're going to start off the webinar this morning with Robert Brehm and Todd Valentine. They're co-executive directors at the New York State Boards of Elections. I want to thank these gentlemen for joining us today and presenting on the various election reform laws impacting counties, as well as talking about some of the regulations and the e-poll books, or the e-poll books that are going to be coming out shortly. So with that, I'm going to turn the call over to Todd and Robert to walk us through their presentation.
Yeah, good morning. This is Todd Valentine here. Along with me is Bob Brehm. And we're here at the Office of the State Board of Elections, and we have about 20 some odd chapters and soon to be chapters that we want to run through. So we'll just kind of dive through it, and then obviously, you know, if you have questions, put them in, enter them as they've been asked, and then we'll try to address those after we've gone through this. Voter pre-registration, one of the first that came out. This, oddly enough, doesn't take effect until January 2020, but this extends what we currently have with pre-registration for those who are 17 to those who would be 16, and obviously they don't become a voter until their 18th birthday. Fairly straightforward. You know, the current system already addresses this one, and it will have some impact on the counties in the sense they'll have to do some updating to their registration systems to allow for the change, but that's a fairly straightforward one. So we're starting easy. So the next one is a much greater impact, the transfers of voter registration and enrollment, or often referred to as statewide transfers. What this did was change, is a bigger change than it looks on paper, and it's in effect now. It started in March of this year, and what this did was when a person moved, people often move between counties, and what this did was set up a system where if the new county receives notice that a voter has moved either through some return piece of mail or through the Department of Motor Vehicles registration process. What they do now is look statewide to see if they were indeed registered in another county and then transfer that registration to the new county from the old county. It's went into effect before we could make any changes with either the county's registration system or the statewide registration system, but we have put in place existing, workaround's not the correct term, but we utilizing the existing infrastructure, we established a system that allows us to operate under the current environment, but we also recognize that going forward, resources will need to be dedicated both at the county end and at the state end to make this a smoother process for the voter. We'll talk about it a little bit later because it dovetails with the voting process, but it seems simple in principle, but difficult in operation, and we have a couple boards of election that are on the line that can talk about it a little bit later. This has been talked about for quite some time for those who've been following election law. Again, took effect earlier this year at the end of January. This was the LLC, the limited liability company under New York law, was treated as a person for quite some time, and the legislature transformed that, didn't change the LLC. They were still operating as an LLC. All this did was say when they make contributions, it's subject to them to an annual limit, and then they need to identify or disclose the identity of the interest so that the contribution limit will pass to the actual owners of the LLC. And that is in effect now. This is a big change, the consolidation of the primary elections. For the last, I would say 6 years, I've lost track. New York State has had what we call a split primary. Federal offices, pursuant to a court order, ran in April, so U.S. Senate, Congress, and then the state and local offices ran in what was the September primary. The September primary had been around since 1974, when the state had changed from a June primary to September. What this law did was then move it back, turn the clock back, so to speak, and bring both of those primaries together in June, the fourth Tuesday in June, which would be effective for this year. We're going to come up a little bit later on some other chapters that impacted that. But this is what, if you're running this year, so there are no federal offices up this year. So it's really just the local primary, in addition to one state legislative office that, due to a vacancy, was filed this year. So the primary, and from that point forward, the calendar was changed to have the signatures started to get filed earlier, petitions were circulated earlier. It will change the calendar for when judicial conventions will be had, and this is all geared towards making sure that the ballots were done in time in order to transmit those, particularly to the overseas and military voters. They're using the the required federal 45-day transit period. That's now extended to all of the voters. So that was the purpose of moving the primary from September to June, to make sure that that got accomplished. And it allowed for what we all know as an adversarial ballot access process to take place. Petitions get filed, they can get challenged, both administratively and through the court system. Early voting. This also is a significant change in New York State. It's not new to a lot of other states. The legislature has decided to have 9 days of early voting, commencing on the 10th day before the election. That will apply not for the June primary, but starting this November. So the first day that early voting will commence this year will be October 26th, and then run through that Sunday. So it'll cover 2 different weekends. It essentially will apply 60 hours of voting that the county boards will designate at least one per 50,000 voters a site, and those sites for early voting are to be designated by May 1st. So counties are in the process of finding a site that's large enough, available enough to accommodate that length of time. And then in addition, when you get to the regular election day, the full list of poll sites will be open. But part of what the budget provided for this early voting was $10 million, which has to be distributed among the county boards of elections to reimburse the cost for early voting. There'll be another grant program we'll mention in a little bit. The state board is working with obviously our State Office of General Services, as well as the Division of the Budget, to provide the mechanism for counties to access that funds. And we were hoping to have an announcement on the process for that soon. We don't have a date. We're still meeting on that. So moving on to the next chapter, which, as I said, the temporary reduction. This related back to the June primary bill. Because of the sudden change in the calendar, the legislature reduced signature requirements for this year for public office and for a couple different times. We've already been through that process for the June primary, so it's a little bit old news. But one of the chapters which reduced the signature requirements for county party office, or county committee as we often refer to it, extends through to next year of December 2020. And that's designed because parties either run in an odd year or an even year. It made the playing field level for parties who ran this year and who run for next year. But beginning next year for the June primary, we expect the signature requirements to go back to their normal amounts because the other chapter is sunset. So we've been through that process. Again, one of the big projects we've talked about was e-poll books or electronic poll books. This is an opt-in or an option for the counties to utilize these. It's not a necessary tool for early voting, but it is an immensely helpful tool for early voting, and it will vary depending upon the size of the county. We're working with, again, our office, the New York State Office of General Services, to put together a baseline state contract for counties to purchase off of. But they're still free to do their own contracts. They're not required to use the state purchase. We're in the process of putting together a list of approved vendors. We've previously circulated to the county boards as well as the known vendor community the list of what we believe are the functional and security requirements for that system. And we expect, or at least are on schedule, to have an approved vendor at the beginning of June, and we're working on this statewide contract. Related to that, as you may have heard in the budget, also put in for electronic poll books, another item called the on-demand ballot printer, also an extremely useful tool for early voting, as well as the cyber security that relates to both of those systems, $14.7 million. Again, we're working on a distribution method for the counties and what the counties will have to do, and the exact amounts we'll get will be announced soon. We don't have a deadline for that, but it will be soon. Time off the vote. This related to extending what was an existing process in statute, where voters who are unable to attend to the polls outside of working hours could get at least 2 hours of time off to vote. This extended it to 3 hours, and would apply to all the primary, special, and general elections for state, federal, and local offices, and then effective immediately. We modified the notice that we produced for employers. This would cover both public and private employers, and it doesn't require that the voter, the applicant, or the employee or the voter prove that they need the time off to vote. It's just a time granted to them, that 3-hour window that would be paid. It's not quite a holiday, because technically under the law, Election Day was already a holiday, although most people, aside from those in the election field, don't celebrate it. But this will allow, in addition to the early voting, should allow a better access for voters to be able to get to the polls either during early voting or at least certainly have the time off that's provided by all their employers. Now I'm going to turn over to Bob for the balance of the chapters and laws.
Oh, primary day hours. This chapter, or portion of the chapter, would make uniform the primary hours throughout the state. There's, besides the city of New York, 8 other counties currently open on primary day at 6 a.m. The rest of the state opens at noon. This law will require that all primary days be uniform and 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. That goes into effect next year for elections held after April 30th. There's also a provision in the budget bill to prohibit lobbyist PACs and independent expenditure committees from making certain loans. So a lobbyist PAC or IE are prohibited from making loans to candidates or political committees. So that law went into effect immediately. The Voter Enfranchisement Modernization Act. This portion of the bill will require the creation of an online voter registration system at the State Board of through the State Board of Elections, connected with the county boards of elections, to allow individuals to complete an application online. It has a 2-year effective date after enactment to provide time to build such a system. I think we'll speak more about that during the budget portion, I think, which is later in the slides. Public Campaign Financing and Election Commission. The budget created authorized a commission to examine, evaluate, and make binding recommendations for a voluntary public campaign financing system in New York State for statewide and state legislative offices. The guideline is to design a system such that it would have $100 million annual fiscal cost, or not more than that. Their report, assuming they're fully established, their report is due by December 1st, and the legislature can modify anything that they've proposed by way of a law. But if they haven't completed that by December 22 of this year, the recommendations of the commission would go into effect. And then the commission expires December 31st. And it's a wide range of topics that are in their wheelhouse to review. This bill is mostly an area in the city of New York where people make filings both at the Campaign Finance Board and required to file with the State Board of Elections. So this bill has passed both houses. It's waiting to go over to the governor for consideration, but it would exempt those who file electronically through another reporting system that's similar to ours, to not have to do things twice. This bill has passed both houses of the legislature. Again, it's waiting the trip to the executive chamber, and it would require county boards of elections to publish contribution limits on their website for offices that are run locally. This is a bill that would kind of came out of the lawsuit that we had a few years ago with when there was a constitutional amendment on the backside of the ballot, on one of the faces of the ballot. At that time, we had required the counties to put an instruction that the ballot had more information on the other side, basically the turn it over instruction. This would put that into statute. The Voter-Friendly Ballot Act. This is a proposal to rewrite Article 7 of the election law to make clear the requirements for preparing ballots for use by voters in an effort to try and make them more user-friendly. That has passed both houses. It's waiting to go to the governor for consideration also. This is a cleanup bill, new party nomination date change from the uniform primary bill that was signed into law earlier this year. The first-time parties, so the Libertarian and the SAM party, are new parties that were created after the governor's race last year. The deadline in statute now for them to make nominations is too late to allow enough time to get the general election ballot out to comply with the MOVE Act. So this bill has passed both houses, and it would move that date to September 1st, which is a Sunday. Labor Day is a holiday, so it effectively is September 3rd. Two constitutional amendments passed the legislature this year. One would remove the 10-day voter registration cutoff. If adopted, the legislature would then be able to consider legislation that would provide for registration deadlines closer to election day, and including same day. The second one would remove a clause that's in right now the absentee ballot, and the Constitution requires a reason, a cause, to have an absentee ballot. The second bill would remove if adopted, would remove that requirement, so the legislature could adopt other laws that could include no excuse absentee voting. Since they had first-time passage during this legislative session, a new legislature would have to be elected and then consider the bill. So the earliest they could do that would be 2021. If it receives second passage, it could, depending on when, it could go on the ballot in 2021, and then the legislature would be available to change the laws in 2022. So that would be a number of years out. State fiscal year budget. Just a quick wrap up. Last year's budget included authorization to spend a federal grant. New York's share of that grant was $19.5 million. It was a 2018 Help America Vote Act cybersecurity grant that states could use to improve its cyber response. Required a 5% local match. Also, the state included a $5 million appropriation for the same purpose. This year's budget took the $5 million cybersecurity grant and reappropriated it, the unspent money, but it also allowed the State Board of Elections to use those funds for the day-to-day operation of the State Board of Elections. So that is a change from last year for those funds. So that's the general highlight of what was in the budget. And it completes our slide version.
Okay, thank you, Todd and Robert, for that presentation. We really appreciate you guys being able to provide some insight on these election reform laws. Our next speaker, Amy Hild and Darlene Harris, for the time being. Amy and Darlene are both commissioners of Board of Elections in Schenectady County. Darlene is the current president of the New York State Association of Election Commissioners, and Amy is the chairwoman of the New York State Association of Election Commissioners Executive Committee. Amy and Darlene, like Tony, are working on the ground to implement these policy reforms. Thank you both for being with us today. It would be great if you could provide a reaction to Robert and Todd's presentation and tell us a little bit about what's going on regionally and within Schenectady County.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, I love the picture. Amy and I are working along with the state throughout the year, and the rest of our counties are doing the same. In relation to some of the election reforms that have been pushed out to the counties, we're devising different procedures and things of that nature. A lot of what was discussed by Bob and Todd this morning is some of it is what I'll term as non-impacting, things like the LLC loophole that doesn't really directly affect us, and some of the other reforms do not affect the board directly. Two items jump out as a direct impact, and that, of course, would be the early voting process, and then the e-poll books would be a secondary one that you know, we're all kind of grappling with in our counties. One of the things I wanted to speak of too, I'll just touch base on this briefly. The voter pre-reg, the 16-year-old voter pre-reg, I have found in various conversations that there potentially is a misconception out in the outside world that 16-year-olds are now going to be able to vote. You know, I just want to reiterate that is a pre-registration. We currently pre-register 17-year-olds as it is right now. Registering a 16-year-old in current capacity with some software changes and things like that, it's not going to be extremely impacting at our county board. Early voting itself, a lot of different things coming down, a lot of different calendars, you know, just trying to figure out how we're going to roll it all out. Amy and I have been working, and all of our other fellow counties have been working diligently on trying to find vote centers that can accommodate the early voting process, centers or voting areas that may differ from other locations, the standard poll sites that we use on election day and such. And some of us have some difficulty in trying to find locations that will accommodate us for that length of time, for that 9 to 10 day period, kind of taking over a little bit of space in some various facilities and or buildings. The budget allotment that was outlined by the state board that the budget or that the New York State has provided to us, you know, those numbers or those dollar values are a statewide, and that would be inclusive of New York City. Some of us feel that, you know, that certainly there's not enough money that has been prepared. We're hoping maybe in 2020 there might be a variation in the budget, but we'll work with what we were provided at this point in time. And I'll just speak a little bit about the electronic poll books. Bob and Todd again spoke to, we as counties have the option of selecting or utilizing the electronic poll books. The legislators have also given us obviously the backing behind that so that we can actually use them this year if we so desire. Many of our counties, the 62 counties, 27 of our counties as it stands right now, are actually going to potentially only operate one site, and in all likelihood that would be their own election board itself. So the paper poll books might be something that's very doable in those particular circumstances. The remaining counties, you know, are looking at multi-sites, and they would need or would require an electronic poll book in order to have those multi-sites have some sort of connectivity and be able to process not only the voters in a timely and efficient manner, but also retain that voter history and have that in a real-time component, because those are some of the other legislative pieces that we have to work with in carrying out this process and making the outside public aware and maintaining some of the current laws as to, you know, what we make available to the outside public. So those are just some of my thoughts and about, you know, some of the early reform. And I think Amy has a couple of her own as well. So I'll turn it over to Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've been meeting regionally, as Darlene indicated, and we're located in Region 2. We met in March. One of the things we have proposed is a universal schedule for early voting. So there are parameters to work within for early voting, and Darlene and I have proposed a regional schedule, and many of the counties in our region have agreed to the schedule, and we think that will help voters who are moving from county to county to have universal hours within a region. So it will be a minimum of 60 hours over the 9-day period. We also, as Darlene mentioned, have been working to get our early voting sites that is by May 1st, we will be certifying those locations. And I think other than that, if Tony wants to speak, and then that should allow some time for questions.
All right, Amy and Darlene, thank you both for sharing your insight into what's going on in Region 2 within Schenectady County, how you guys are working on implementing for early voting. Tony Scannapieco is the Commissioner of Board of Elections in Putnam County. He's now with us this morning. He's also the co-chair of the Policy Committee with the Association of Election Commissioners. Tony, thank you very much for being with us. If you'd like, please go ahead. We have your slide up on the screen now, and feel free to present on what's going on in Putnam County and some of the reforms, that are happening across the state, and your reaction to those.
Okay. First of all, that picture is about 25 years old. But listening to commissioners from Schenectady, I just want to mention one thing. We both had cyber security incidents, which did not affect the board, but affected the county. I know we were shut down for like 2 weeks by the state board, by Homeland Security. So Monday night, myself and Commissioner Croft, my counterpart, we did a information such like this for the League of Women Voters. And one of the questions that kept coming up when we started talking about the electronic poll books is the security. I have a problem, a concern about that, and so did many of the people that were in the room. We went so far from everything as we were so separate. Now we're going to be, on the clouds, whatever we're going to do if we're going to do electronic poll books, and it seems to be a concern. Another thing about the electronic poll books that is a concern is signatures. If you're signing with your finger or a stylus, is it going to look anything like your signature that you have on your registration form? So, that's, what the concerns were. Most of the other things didn't seem to, because they actually used we actually used your send out, and a lot of that was answered. And then another thing was, because we're going to have one poll site at the Board of Elections, we haven't run into the problems that some of the larger counties have. But the question was asked that, well, next year, will you have it in the presidential election on the other side of the county? And I said, and who's going to pay for it? And then there was dead silence. So, and speaking of paying for things, Putnam County has no primaries, so we will not have a primary. Mary Ellen was very happy when I told her that. So Putnam County is saving money this year because we're not having primaries.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for the update. I really appreciate it. I want to now turn to a partner in the legislature who's been working on these early voting reforms, Assemblyman Chuck Levine. Assemblyman Levine is the chair of the Election Laws Committee in the Assembly and the sponsor of early voting legislation, which was signed into law earlier this year. Assemblyman Levine represents the 13th Assembly District, which includes portions of Nassau County, and he's also a member of the Committee on Codes, Ethics, and Guidance, Rules, Insurance, and the Judiciary. Assemblyman, we're very happy to have you with us today. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy day to be with us on this important webinar that we're having on early voting. I'll turn it over to you if you would like to offer some remarks.
Good morning, everyone. And Mark, please give Steve our warmest and best regards, and hoping that his mom is doing well. I also want to thank NYSAC, which for many, many years has done such an outstanding job of representing our counties in the state of New York and elsewhere, and also the State Board of Elections and all the local boards of election for everything they do. So let me say this. I'm just going to describe essentially two separate features here. One has to do with the changes that were made, and the other has to do with some considerations that I know we'll all have to deal with respect to making voting easier for New Yorkers. So to begin with, there was certainly great and dynamic change in terms of the election law in January. In fact, I think most of these things were passed, most of these major issues which have been discussed already were passed within the first or second day of our session and have been enacted into law. Most of the major changes have already been enacted, which is not to say that there won't be further changes, but I don't know that they will be quite as dynamic or great as those that we have already adopted. And now a few considerations that I know we will all be dealing with. To be sure, there will be unanticipated costs to the counties for inspectors and for mailing the transfers that will be required because of the changes in the law. As you know, you'll need to develop early voting plans by May 1st, which I think was discussed earlier. And transitioning to the electronic poll books is certainly going to be necessary for the counties, especially for the larger counties, to implement early voting. There has been some state funding made available to assist, which is going to be helpful. But none of us believes that those state spending assistance factors are going to cover all the costs. And we also know that increasing registration numbers are likely going to drive up the cost of ballot and mailing costs over time. And we also know that the more we focus on changes to our voting system in New York State, the greater the public will appreciate that we are making things easier for them, finally, and the more people will hopefully register, although experience in other states has taught us that that is something that's going to occur over time. That's my little speech for this morning, but again, many, many thanks to all of you for all you do.
Assemblyman, thank you so much for those comments and talking a little bit about your proposals, your legislation. We really appreciate your continued partnership working with NYSAC and New York State County. So thank you for being with us today. Okay, with that, this concludes today's webinar. I want to take a moment to thank today's panel members for sharing an update on election reforms, which are, as you heard, in various forms of implementation. I also want to thank all of our participants on today's call, and of course our sponsor, NTS Data Services. A recording of the webinar and a PDF copy of today's presentation will be posted to the NYSAC website. And with that, we have a few moments for questions. Please, as Jeanette mentioned early on, if you do have a question, please type it in the question box on your webinar dashboard, and we will try to get to all of our questions. If not, we will get answers and provide you with answers to your questions. So the first question we have is, we are concerned about the 3 hours to vote will work, how that will work. Is it just 3 hours, the actual time needed to vote, or can an employee change, can that be changed? Can it be some other derivative other than just 3 hours? So I think, Robert and Todd at the State Board of Elections might be best to answer this question. Gentlemen, do you want to take a stab at it?
Well, the statute requires 3 hours. It doesn't, it does specify that, you could come to some mutual agreement as to when that occurs, but it doesn't mandate that it could be anything less. So it's 3 hours. I don't know how to describe that any better.
Okay, thanks, Robert and Todd, thank you. Okay, the next question is, go ahead, Tony.
This is Bob Brehm. We posted the updated statute and the notice that's required to be available on the State Board website. There are a few FAQs in that posting. We have other questions, so as time allows, we will update FAQs in that same spot so that we can, as opposed to keep answering the same question over and over, it might help in that regard. But generally speaking, not a lot has changed because they had up to 2 hours before. Now it's 3 hours, and it removes at the beginning or end of the day if they didn't have enough time around their work environment. So it's a straight 3 hours now, without consideration to the period of time that they work.
Robert, I think thank you for sharing that. And I think what we'll do is we will point people to the State Board of Elections and your FAQ so everyone can see timely updates as you guys make them. In the same vein, the next question I have here is, does time off to vote apply to early voting as well as the general and primary elections?
The State Board of Election has opined that we believe it does not. It applies to Election Day. The wording in the early voting as to days of early voting as opposed to Election Day, which is the reference and the time off to vote, are specifically different. And we have opined that it applies to Election Day, not days of early voting.
Okay, thank you. And the last question we have here is, will the transfer of registration only work if the voter registers in the new location?
No, the registration, if you're registered in New York State and you move within New York State, your registration and your enrollment will go with you. So the enrollment was a provision that was amended in the statute in the mid-1990s. Prior to that, your enrollment would follow you when you move from county to county. So this bill reinstates that provision, but it also says if you move from one county to the other, as long as you were registered to vote in New York State, you would be entitled to vote. There still is the provision in the Constitution that you have to be a resident of the new political subdivision 30 days before the date of the election to vote in that political subdivision. But you don't have to, we don't call it re-registering, it's transfer, it's notifying the board that you have moved so that you can update your record to be available in the new county.
Right, and it's Todd here. On the notice, and the question, to rephrase it a little bit, is how will the county board know you have moved to your new spot? And that will be accomplished in several different ways. One, the voter can actually tell the county board themselves. They can submit a new registration application, updating their registration. They're free to do that. If they change their address with the postal service, we do verify addresses on an annual basis, and we could pick it up that the county board, the new county board can pick up the change of address that way. If you change your address and with the Department of Motor Vehicle and complete the address form that's part of their registration, the voter registration process, those also get sent to the new county board of elections. So there's a variety of ways. And the last way that we can find out is if you, the voter, shows up to their new county because they have moved, they figured out where their polling place is from various resources, they can then complete what we would call an affidavit at the time and attest that, yes, I indeed have moved and that my votes have counted. The county will be able to verify that they're a registered voter through the statewide registration system. So we have a variety of ways to pick up how people move.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. And actually, we have time for one more question, and it looks like we have one here. And the question goes back to what we were speaking about earlier, and that is, can we use employee accrue time as pay time off for the 3-hour allotted time to vote? So this it kind of hits back on what was touched on earlier as far as allowing employees that 3 hours to go to the polls on election day to vote.
I think it's like, well, first of all,
That's a very good question.
it's a good question. It's more of a labor law question than an election law question. So we've heard that from a number of people. So I'm not sure if that will make it into our FAQ or if we will try and get the Labor Department to give us the
Some
most
information.
productive answer there. You know, again, I say it's no different than up till this law went into effect, where they had 2 hours off. Now they have 3 hours off. So the current, how you handle them is just for 1 more hour under the law.
Okay.
And the only other real change is there was a calculation of, you know, did they have time at the beginning or end of their shift to still get to the polls? That was removed from the statute. It required that and I think it moved the deadline for an employee to tell their employer to 2 days before the election. And it says days, it doesn't say business days in the statute. So we consider that to be days.
Okay, great. And it looks like I said that last question was the last one, but it looks like we had one more that came in. And this has to go back to dealing with registration. Do you use the original registration date from the previous county, or do you use the registration date of when we received it?
It's when as Todd had mentioned, the workaround, you know, I remind people, there's no money in the budget to pay for any of these technological changes. So as resources become available, we will make technological changes to the system that will improve the communication between counties. But in order to use the system the way it's designed now, the date is the date that the new county processes that form in order to make sure that the communications work the way the system is currently designed.
Okay, great. Well, again, I just want to take just a moment to thank our speakers with us today, Todd Valentine, Robert Brehm from the State Board of Elections, Amy Hild and Darlene Harris from Schenectady County, and Tony Scannapieco from Putnam County. Thank you all for providing your thoughtful insight into how counties are reacting to the early voting and other voting reform changes this year. And a special thank you as well to Assemblyman Chuck Levine, the chair of the Assembly Election Laws Committee. Really appreciate having the Assemblyman with us today. And lastly, to our sponsor of today's webinar, NTS Data Services. As I mentioned earlier, today's copy of the webinar and the presentation in a PDF format will be posted to the NYSAC website. And we look forward to working with everyone as implementation gets underway. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to NYSAC, and we'll be happy to try and get those answered for you. Thank you, everyone.